Goes live, I want to be full disclosure. With my medical thing, I've been, I had surgery. I'm just being honest, I have this colostomy bag, and every so often, it makes noises that I can't control.
Can we turn some music on over there?
So I'm just letting you know ahead of time, because at the mass on Friday, of course, I'm sitting there and all of a sudden it's like, oh shit.
You just got a cough.
I'm like, why is this happening?
Alright,
So I'll try to muffle it again.
We're live.
All right, thanks everybody for coming to the first budget meeting. We'd like to call this meeting to order. And with that, is there any public comments? I will make a comment. I'd like to thank everybody for attending. Also to welcome our two new committee members, Alderman Carmichael and Alderman Leja. And this is the first of our meetings. We do a preliminary meeting with the department heads, and then what they do is listen to us, we listen to them, and get their feedback and see what their challenges are with the budget, what they're doing, their needs and wants. And then from there, they come back to the table. We'll come back and have more budget meetings down the road. It's a pretty tight time frame. They've been working on these budgets for several months. So it's nothing that they just started today. So they've been talking about this probably since July, if not sooner, and going from there. So this is the process, and we will turn it over to now, Ben, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you, Chairman Lennon. And today we will be talking about the IT, Information Technology 2022 budget, as well as do our best to look forward 3 years after that. I'd like to introduce our IT Director, James Frank. I will go through some line items, but then I will turn it over to Jim, who will talk further from his vantage point about the IT department. Before we go forward though, I wanted to illustrate on the reports that you're looking at. We call it a budget worksheet report that comes from our system. What it allows us to do is look back at the last 3 audited years, 2018, 2019, and 2020. Those are audited results. And then we also present our adopted 2021 budget. The next column gives you an indication of the transactions that have posted in our system thus far. I'd like to illustrate that for the expenses, most of the expenses are posted through September 30th. And that's where at the top, where it says percentage of budget, our target percentage is 75%. So, in reviewing the expenses, we could, get into the items that are under or over that amount. From that point, working with our department heads, we are able to get their feedback and produce an initial draft of 2022. But in addition to that, we are looking forward to 3 additional years after that. Now, of course, this is just a high-level overview on where things are going to come in, but it just gives us all a sketch of what things hold in the future. So to begin with the IT department, there's really, there's maybe one revenue item if there was a reimbursement or something like that. There's a small dollar amount of $420, but normally there's not much revenue that goes into the information technology department. So we will get right into the expenditures. We start with salaries and wages, and then payroll related expenditures. And from the salaries and wages, for now we've projected a 2.75 non-union increase for 2022, and we're just making the assumption for now that for COLA raises it goes up maybe 2% in the years afterwards. The next line items are items for stipends and buyback, sick time buyback accruals. In addition to, we map out our health insurance and dental. And our health insurance, we're projecting at 5% for now. We normally get our final health insurance rate sometime in February. So lately, our broker from Berwyn Insurance, they've been able to negotiate low health insurance rates, so we're hoping that that follows suit, you know, this upcoming year as well. So our dental, we're projecting a 10% increase throughout the years. And then, of course, we have our IMRF employee, our employee pension withholding, not withholding, but the city's contribution to the pension for our IMRF employees. And then it's just our FICA Medicare expenditures that result in the payroll and related expenditures from that standpoint.
So in your department, there's no union employees?
No.
Good.
But one question I always get regarding those first few accounts is what are the stipends for? About 3 years ago, the BDC director, Dave Holzberg, came to me and the mayor and said, we're not happy with the company that we're paying to manage our IT. We would like your office, your IT department, to take over IT management for the Berwyn Development Corporation. So we all got together and met, and we figured out how to do that without adding new staff. So what happens is every year, when the money is exchanged for the BDC from the city to fund it, a certain percentage of that is earmarked and left in our accounts to be distributed to the staff that I manage in a small percentage twice a year as a salary stipend. So that's what it's for. It's in lieu of adding new headcounts and new employees and new benefit costs and all the other stuff that goes along with it. We were able to take on the responsibility of managing that office, which is small in numbers, but they're pretty high end in terms of what they're able to. I mean, Scott knows better than anybody, being as involved as you have been with the BDC for years. They're accomplishing quite a bit, so it's a small number of people, but technically they're much more advanced than a lot of other offices in the city. So it becomes a bit of a challenge for us, and we figured the best way to compensate staff, existing staff, was to give them a small stipend without increasing all the other costs that we have to bear to add employees. So that's one line you'll see on here that isn't necessarily on every department's budget, because I don't know if stipends exist in all the operations in the city. So I always want to explain that one because that question comes up every couple of years.
Thank you.
So I'll get into the expenditure accounts at any point if anyone has any questions or wants any clarification on matters, please let me know. Alderman Leisure called me, or I called him the other day because he had some questions, and he asked some very good questions based on this document that I provided all of you. At a high level, this document, as I realized about 4 or 5 years ago, that in order for me to track and produce accurate budget numbers, I have to internally keep my own metrics in terms of spending trends. And by that I mean, as our operation advances here and as we become more technically competent and more advanced, certain operating costs begin to increase over time. Just as the longer you keep certain equipment, much like your vehicle, the more it costs to maintain and service and do parts. So I had to figure out, okay, in order for me to accurately forecast what my next year's budget request is going to be, I have to have some data to look at from years past to see what I've spent. So I came up with doing this, and I took all of my expenditure accounts and I broke them into individual tables that I provide to the aldermen. It's not so detailed that it's not an example of every type of transaction, but it gives you a high level of what costs I bear that go into the lump sum number you see on the summary page from that. So it breaks out all of my expenditure accounts and it gives you some itemized detail with respect to how that money's spent. And one question that Alderman Leisure had was, well, when you're asking for a certain amount in 2022, how do you know already that you're going to project more or less the following year? And the answer to that question is very simple. When I know there's a trend that supports an increase or decrease one way, you'll see the deviation in my projected for the future years. When I don't know, I start with my base cost, because I don't have any reason to think it's going to change, so I just leave it alone. So even though I might think it's going to be lower this year, I still have to assume conservatively that it might be that amount a little bit higher next year. So in order to not over tweak, when I don't know what's going to happen and I can't predict, I leave it the way that it was before. Because that doesn't really apply for now, we're talking about 2022. But we have those numbers for 2024 just to begin the process. So that's why you see some sort of odd up and down on some things that aren't noted. It's just more a tool that I use so that I have a baseline, and I start from that when I look at next year. So the most accurate are obviously the ones that are bolded for 2022. I know exactly based on my data, these are the numbers that I wish to request for 2022. As we go further in the future, it becomes harder to forecast because I don't know what events in the city, what trends are gonna happen, what direction we're gonna go in every area of the city. IT is one of those areas that's changing so quickly and so fast. Some ways for the better and some ways for the worse. I mean, it's debatable, as anyone that's in the field knows, there's good and bad to everything. But we have to think about how do we put those dollars aside to best support our vision, as well as, bear the burden into the future of securing this very complex environment, which over the last couple of years has become the vast majority of what I do, is making decisions to harden the security posture of our environment. And that's one of the number one priorities that I have, is making sure that all of our data, wherever it lives, is safe, secure, and accessible. So with that, I'm gonna go into a couple of these accounts. Vehicle maintenance, real small number. We have a single vehicle. It's not assigned to anybody. It doesn't leave City Hall. It's parked in our lots here. It's an old police car that we use to go between our 8 locations during the day, so my staff doesn't have to depend on their own personal vehicles. That vehicle is in the enterprise lease that you all approved, but from what the Public Works Director has told me, I'm not very high on the list, so I don't know if it's gonna be swapped out in 2022. I don't know. I mean, if we get there, great, but if we don't, I have to assume that I'm gonna have the same vehicle, so I have to leave around the same numbers in the budget for service. That goes in for things like oil change, or if we blow a tire, or if anything like that happens, that's not a major expense, that's where that money comes from. We really don't even use it much because a lot of the regular maintenance is just covered under Public Works. Next account is our dues and membership publications. I'm a member of a couple of IT-related consortiums for IT directors in this area. That is the small $1,000 portion of that. The larger portion of that is the Know Before Security Awareness Training, which I do urge all of you, and I believe you guys, I don't know if you started it yet, but the other two, you guys completed it. So you guys have seen what Know Before does, the security awareness training that we provide to all employees. That's how we pay for it out of that amount. We know that over the next couple of years, because we signed a 5-year contract, those costs are not going to increase. So it covers everyone that we employ in the same kind of library and classes that you all saw. So that's what that is. Any questions so far? Office supplies, very simple. Pens, papers, things like that. In my office, we're pretty digital. We don't do that much on paper. However, there's some processes that we do have to document, like our timesheets and our payables, so we have some supply costs throughout the course of the year. 3,000 was my baseline, but I actually think that's a little high, so as we go farther into the future, I believe that number's gonna come down, which I'm proud of because we're becoming more digital. There's an abundance of paper. I mean, just look around, even in the room here, this is where we store everything. So we're trying very hard through products like Laserfiche and other document management solutions that we use to get as much digitized and off of our shelf. So I've cleared out a whole bunch of stuff and I've just, digitized things. And we're working towards the right direction of reducing our paper flow around the city. Now we get into probably the most general account, general expenses. The main thing to know about that is we pay, and the reason why I have this bolded, when we go through this list and you see items that are in bold, those are subsets of the account that I want to talk a little bit about here today, because this year, or next year's request is going to signal a significant change. We're seeing that to service and support our fleet of printers, which is about 250 strong across the 8 locations, the cost of doing that are starting to go way up to the point of 20–30% per year. There's a lot of reasons for it. The equipment's getting older, the supplies are just costing more, and in some cases, in my opinion, there's an excessive amount of printing being done by various departments. So I would ask you as the committee to ask the departments, especially our big ones, police, fire, library, do they need as many printing devices that they have? Because they're the biggest, I don't want to say offenders, but users of printing, where we do have options to go digital. And they don't realize the effect and the cost because they don't pay for it. I do. But like you see, we go from in the 20s, the mid-20s, to 37.5 because, and it's the same number of devices, so it's costing $10,000 more a year to support the same stuff. That's a concern to me. It's something I wanted to talk about because I believe in some cases we don't need a 1-to-1 ratio of employee to device, and we have that in some places in the city. So I strongly urge you all to ask the departments to emphasize reductions in printing consumption as we move into 2022. The other types of expenses in there, we do cabling projects, we have miscellaneous IT things that come up. They're really just, you know, an account that earmarks those miscellaneous costs. So when we develop new offices or when we have new builds, we have to find a place for those general expenses, and that's where that goes. The next account taps to something I said earlier with the relationship we have with the BDC. Part of the BDC contract stipulates through the support that we provide of IT services that they fund, it's about $22,000 a year, which includes the stipends that I mentioned, in the IT support. So as we replace their equipment, we upgrade their software, we provide services that involve costs for the BDC. On paper, in our general ledger, we'd like to separate that out so we know which costs are going specifically for that. All that account does is support the expenditures for the BDC. The next account I have is professional services. This is one I'm actually very proud of, because if you look at other municipalities, even some of the larger ones, they depend a lot on outside contractors to do IT work. And to me, it's just a difference of opinion. I would rather use those resources to have staff trained in that area so that we are managing employees that support the environment versus paying an outside company that isn't as personally invested in the sanctity of operations. It's just a philosophy difference. So we have a relatively low amount of money earmarked for professional services because we don't hire contractors to do very much IT work. A couple exceptions to that: the website, because we don't have a real developer in-house for stuff, and mobile apps. So we have some costs. The big change last year was when we redirected the money to the city administrator's office to oversee the redevelopment of our website. I can tell you, I don't want to speak for Claudia, but we are definitely making progress in that. We've narrowed things down to a couple of very good vendors, so we know which direction we're going to go. But I'll let her talk more about that as we move forward, because some interesting things and some exciting things happening on that front.
And she'll also be reaching out to the Aldermanic Communications Committee to start talking about what they've been looking at and getting input as we're moving forward. So Alderman Carmichael, you can expect them to reach out to you.
I'd say from having conversations with both of you privately, you're all on the same page as far as getting the community involved in determining website-based goals for defining content generation. We're all on the same page. We just got to figure out how we're going to do that and what kind of method we're going to use to reach the people. So that's good to say. And I'd like to say that I hope that's something that we can really take a look at for 2022.
Oh, yeah.
So that's why you see that number shrinking on my side, because with the creation of our communications office, those costs are being shifted to other areas of the city so they can be overseen by a more concentrated group of staff that are more marketing centric than I am. So, repairs and maintenance, this is another one where it has to do with repairs on our vehicles. It's kind of counterproductive to the other one, but it's just one of those general accounts, right, that then exists for everybody. I don't really use it, so I think that's why I zeroed it out.
Yeah, it's the same last four characters that other departments utilize in
Okay.
jail code for.
But with our one vehicle, when it doesn't work, we just drive our own car, so I really don't have any expenditures in that one. Hardware maintenance are the costs that I bear. There's two types of costs with hardware maintenance. There's the ongoing, reoccurring, contractual-based service agreements that we have for our big devices. We have a very large UPS system, which is a big electrical device that ensures the electricity of the building stays functional. For this building, that costs money to support every year. All of the hardware-based costs that we have are paid out of that. I don't have anything much changing in that respects for this year, other than to say that if you move out, we see some slight deviations in increases and decreases. The decreases are as a result of planned upgrades. Our phone system right now is about 12 years old. It's fine because it's supported by AT&T, but it is becoming more costly to maintain because the technicians and the staff that AT&T has to employ to support the type of equipment that we have cost them more, so they pass those costs down onto us. So we're looking at some cloud-based options and some other options to bring the same type of phone service that we have here to our staff with lowered costs. So we'll get into that as we go farther down. So that's why if you look at 2023, 24, I'm hoping that we bring those costs down because we'll be doing some upgrades over the course of those years that necessitate the reduction in the maintenance costs. Software maintenance is essentially the same thing except for software. We separate those so that we can clearly delineate between hardware cost and software cost. The two big trends that we've noticed, as we've evolved our environment here to Windows 10 as the standard operating system, we've run into compatibility issues with some of our legacy or our old Adobe products, specifically the Acrobat and the Creative Suite. So it's necessitated our dependence on the Adobe Creative online licensing, the cloud-based models. There's different ways that distributors sell software. It used to be easy. You just tell them you want X number of licenses, and you buy them one time, you have them. Now everything is subscription-based, so it generates ongoing costs for these big players like Adobe and Microsoft. So we've had to move to a cloud-based model. That's what they mean by SaaS, software as a service, for our Adobe professional users, Ben and Dana included, and that generates annual costs. So we've seen those numbers go from nothing 2 or 3 years ago, 19 and 20, to where we're at 4,500, 5,000 a year, because we're paying those renewable costs to stay current with those software platforms. So again, just as we progress in time and become more dependent on these operations, we have to recognize these new costs. I bring them up because I don't see that trend going anywhere. Everything now, software-wise, is moving to some sort of cloud-centric model, and that's because it provides renewable revenue for the seller of the software. So why charge you once when they can charge you every 12 months? You know? The other one is the Fire Department Records Management System. In 2021, this year earlier, we retired the old Firehouse Records Management System. It's the system the fire department uses to store all of their incident records. We moved it to an online-based, cloud-based system. The cost that we have to bear, because the fire department and IT would split the RMS costs. It was about $7,000 a year, so I would pay $35,000. Now, based on the contracts that we negotiated and the agreements, we don't have those costs. So I only have to pay $500 a year to maintain access to the old legacy system for reporting history. So I'm able to recognize a big cut in that line, enough to mention here in the meeting, because we will not have another renewable cost thanks to some new software decisions that the fire department has pushed through. So that's been a big deal in last year. Other ones are just Microsoft. We have some ongoing licensing and support agreements with Microsoft. Everything here is Office-based, Word-based, Excel-based. We're just a Microsoft operation. So we have some ongoing costs in that capacity. We're looking at some upgrades of the versions for the platform of Office that we run, which is why the 2020 portion, the 2022 portion of that is a little higher than last year. We're trying to get a few more upgrades done than we did this year before, as we move to the newer 2019 platform of Microsoft Office. Okay, the next line, this is our VSAN Cluster. We rebuilt our data center here at City Hall. I think it was 2 years ago, we went through council and we had a lease for that project. We are in year 3 of that lease, I believe, or year 4. I have to check to be sure, but that's a fixed cost based on the contract that was approved to the council. I believe this could be the last year. I have to double check. But once that cost goes away, we will no longer have a lease payment. We'll own the service. So that's what that is. Hardware purchases now. This obviously all of the types of devices that we support, and I try to give you a summary. We target a 5-year refreshment cycle on our city workstations. So just for your information, we support, between the library and the rest of the city, somewhere between 400 and 550 workstations for various purposes. So we try to target about 25 to 30 to replace every year, which doesn't sound like a big number. But when you get into the configurations and the dependence on these things, to get 25 done is a pretty big achievement, as people are really pressed to do other things too. So every year I try to earmark at least 25 replacements. We have ongoing costs, obviously, for our firewall devices, which provide the core of our internet-facing security. So we have to fund that to make sure that we stay up to date on that. Just miscellaneous hardware. The one thing I noted in here is that as we did the police department cluster and server room refresh a few years back, we are targeting doing the same thing for our other data center, which is here at City Hall. So I don't have the actual number put into that, but because we're not sure yet if that's gonna go a couple different directions as far as the capital project. But I am starting to plan as far as how we're gonna fund that. It's in the neighborhood of $30,000 to $40,000 for the one-time cost. Not as large as the PD, it's half the size. So I'm hoping if we can do that without having to pay interest on it over a 3 or 4 year lease, then that would be better. So I make a note of it on here because it's gonna be something that comes up and it's going to be brought into the hardware purchasing line. Next one's pretty easy, software purchasing. At this point, we aren't necessarily exploring, that's what the miscellaneous is really for, new products that come along that we decide we wanna try out. Excuse me, but the first 3 of them are all for reoccurring licensing that we have to pay and obviously expansion for some of the renewable products that we have. So we're heavily dependent on Microsoft Server for all of our servers in Office. So in order to maintain support and upgrade rights and what they call software assurance in the industry, we have to pay these fees every year to maintain our agreements with Microsoft. Let me grab a sip of water here.
You're on a roll.
After I talk for a while, I get a little raspy.
Yeah.
So the biggest chunk of my budget, in terms of expenses, non-salary, is in what we call the network infrastructure line. And this is the line that has the most bold in terms of this document and also the most anticipated change, thanks in large part to ARP and the funding that we have received from the federal government and how that affects our ability to perform some very big infrastructure upgrades and changes, which are going to result in a direct reduction over the next few years to this line item. First, let me just break it down. We pay for all kinds of connectivity here, and it's very expensive. At our core, our 8 sites are connected by 1 gigabit per second links through an MPLS, which is a managed service through AT&T. That is the core of what we call our infrastructure ASE. Might sound like a lot of speed. Obviously, if you had a gigabit both ways at home, you'd be doing real well. But when you have to move around the amount of terabytes per night that we do, and on any given night we're moving around between 10 and 15 terabytes of data in terms of backups, that 1 gig bottleneck is very slow. So it takes me about 14 hours to move 10 terabytes of data between our data centers. We are looking at going through a bid process to move towards what we call a private fiber network, which is dark fiber. It's not connected to a network, it's not a managed service. That would allow us to be only capped by our equipment, which means that instead of paying for a gigabit per second, we can be in the 20 to 30 to 40 gigabits per second. So it's a major increase, a 40 times increase in terms of what we can do. That opens up all kinds of cloud options and disaster recovery options that we do not have here today. So I'm kind of skipping around here, but that is the main focus for my operation for next year is getting our infrastructure updated. Because we've been on this ASC product on and off since, AT&T has rebranded it, but it's been since like 2007. So it's time for us to revisit that and take the next logical step in terms of upgrades so that we can be prepared for the future and have our infrastructure at its core ready for the next 10 plus years of municipal operations. Because where we were at before, just a little history lesson, these buildings used to be connected by T1 circuits. I don't know if you guys are familiar with what those are, but they go back to like the 80s. They're analog circuits that only can do 1.45 megabits per second. So going from 1.45 to 1,000 is an epic increase. And it's huge. It revolutionized things. But now we've traversed so much that 1 gig isn't enough. We need to go to 10 to 20 to 30. So it's just the evolution of our data needs. And going down this road through this process to upgrade our backbone is going to allow us to reach those goals. But to get back to network infrastructure, as we break that big line down, that's budgeted at like 235, I believe, 230,000 a year for 2022. There are certain reoccurring expenses that are service-based that we pay for every year that comprise that. We have been a customer of Island, which is a virtual cloud data center provider, for the last couple of years as we experiment with moving some of our server loads into the cloud. Island is around that 30,000 per year mark, and they provide a data center in Dallas, which is in the cloud that we securely route through. It's actually one of our destination points for off-site backups. For 2022, we're looking at moving that to AWS, which, if you're not familiar, is Amazon Web Services, a big player in the market. They provide the same type of services, and we have gone through testing and compared analysis and believe that we can do the same type of computing in the cloud with a reduction in operating costs. So we're going to be moving those loads over to AWS in 2022. What we call here the PRIs. PRIs are old analog phone trunks. They're old T1 circuits for phones. Our phone system, when it went voice over IP in 2008, used these PRI circuits as the backbones. In other words, when you press 9 to get a line, it would pull one of the connections from the PRIs. Those are very expensive to maintain because they're copper-based, they're like T1s. We were paying the better part of $65K a year to run the 6 PRIs that we had. We replaced that a couple years back with what AT&T calls IP Flex, which is an IP-based service that does the same thing for half the cost. So in 2021, we finished the migration. We phased out those PRIs. That's why when you look at where I'm at for 2021 in terms of that account, I'm actually charging less than that's where I should be, because we're not paying those bills anymore. The IP Flex service that replaced PRIs, much cheaper. So that's an ongoing cost that we're able to save. I point that out because that's why in my document you see that line is phased out completely beginning in 2021, because we're never going to go back to that service. So that's where that's at. Let's see what else do I have here. The cloud-based system. I mentioned this too. We're toying with the idea of moving our phones towards a cloud-based solution. In our research, though, the numbers that I thought we would be at, turns out options are a lot more pricey. So I don't know if that's going to be something that we actually do in 2022. But it's earmarked in our budget for exploration as far as getting our phone systems upgraded. I can tell you that we do need to plan some upgrades because it is reaching its end of life. Avaya had bought a company called Nortel, which was the original provider of our phone systems. Now Avaya owns this line of phone systems, and they're slowly they're slowly sunsetting the product line, which means that they're putting it out to pasture and they're no longer supporting it.
Are we in jeopardy of any support issues with the?
AT&T's assured me for the next 5 years they will continue to support it, but
Yeah.
that's just the word of mouth from our representative. So I'm not worried that it's going to reach end of life. We do have ongoing support that's been very reliable. The problem is it's costing more. So in my mind, we'd be better off redirecting those costs towards a new system as opposed to just paying for maintenance, right? Because we're seeing phones die at a much greater increasing rate every year because they're 12, 13 years old. So, and we have a very heavy volume of use on our phones. So the question is, which direction do we go? In thinking we could go cloud, sounds great, right? But the costs are just really high. So I don't know if that's going to be what we do. But the point is, we put the money in there to kind of look at options and to see what it would take to get to the next step. Anyone, any questions so far? Because I'm almost done. I just want to talk about a couple of capital projects. Internal service charges. Ben can explain that. That's the account I never really understood. It's just the way they take money from our departments.
It's spread.
It's the way they take money
Everybody
from
gets that.
our department so we can pay for all the other ones that have costs.
And it's a departmental allocation for our overall claims, workers' comp, general liability. So depending on your payroll levels or your claims history, we allocate those costs based on it. That's the basis for allocating for each department. And it's normally finalized at year-end when we prepare for our audits.
Good.
All right, so just a couple of capital projects that I have going on. The enterprise backup solution, it's something that we need to revisit. That is being able to overhaul where our backups are stored and the types of storage solutions that we use to facilitate data. It serves into, it's a combination of data retention and security, because the enterprise solution introduces hardened layers of protection to your data, which is important because you don't just want to back up your data, you just don't want to make copies of it. You want to put it in a sandbox that, assuming your environment is compromised or hacked, the attackers, the criminals, cannot get into those systems. They're sandboxed. In other words, the term is air gap. There's air that exists between your data and your live network and where your data is stored. So these solutions introduce that. Very important in the days, we live with ransomware and cyber events happen all the time. We do a very good job of encrypting our data and moving between multiple sites, but you're never done improving your infrastructure. So I can't sit here and say we're 100% bulletproof. I can tell you that based on the resources and funding and support that I have, we are doing everything we can to ensure our data is resilient, redundant, protected, and encrypted. And it is. But doing that takes time, as I said, 12, 13 hours per night of backups, where we need to look at the way that we back up and the solutions that we use and make some decisions with respect to acquiring newer technological devices that are able to store and secure our data at a much greater capacity. So that's what that is. Roughly from general quotes, it's around 200,000, which isn't really bad when you think about the fact that for $100 million+ a year operation, we're storing every byte of data that operates the city. I mean, how do you put a price on your data? You can replace equipment, you can replace buildings, you can't replace data. So if it's gone, it's gone.
And what, so, like Jim mentioned, nothing's 100% foolproof, so that's why a few years back, he actually helped me as we started evaluating the different insurances that were coming to the market with cyber insurance. That was a pretty new product a few years back. Now it's becoming especially more common, especially during COVID, as everyone is doing everything remotely. So, I mean, we did see costs go up, but that's also there as that backup, because no one can ever be 100% covered, no matter what you do. And so what's nice to know is that we do have.
And one of the things that's come out with cyber liability renewals over the last couple of years is that the mandatory requirements to even have the option to buy a policy are increasing, right? And we had no issue because we're already meeting those thresholds. In terms of things like remote access, you have to have multiple factors of authentication. So not just your username and password, but in our case, we use these tokens that generate a unique ID, one-time password, that serve as the second factor of authentication for any remote users. Those are levels of security that Berwyn has never been able to attain before. But now I'm proud to say we do, which means that we're able to renew our policies. There was no questions in terms of our security and cybersecurity assurance. So I'm very happy with where we're at and the strides that we've made. It's just now how do we sit back and finesse what we've done so that we're ready for what the future is going to throw at us. And what I'm trying to say with that is I listened to presentations from the police about cameras for LPR and Axon body cameras and all these storage heavy devices. And it's something that you brought up, Alderman, in some of your questions, and you make good points. I mean, we think about the products, we don't think about the costs and the security that comes along with what you do with that data, right? When we scale an enterprise backup solution out, we don't just scale it to meet our needs today, we scale it for 5 to 6 years down the line. So, for example, if we have 20 terabytes of usable data now that we have to back up, we'll scale a device like this for 150, 200 terabytes, because you're never going to need less storage. It's always more and more and more. So as some of these big projects that involve heavy video dependencies are coming down the pipeline, I have to make decisions that prepare our environment to securely archive and preserve and protect that data where applicable. It's not so much in some of those external projects because those are all vendor maintained, so there's a much closer control over those products. But we have surveillance cameras at most of our buildings. Those consume a lot of space as the camera quality gets greater and greater and greater. So we have this ever increasing amount of storage needs, and we have to make sure that we make decisions so that we can accommodate and address those needs in advance.
And that falls right into your next item, the fiber optic, because you gotta transfer that data.
Exactly. So Ruth has been doing a great job in bringing together all of our qualifiable projects, and I guess you could talk a little bit about how you're gonna, how that's gonna come to the council.
Yeah, of course. More than likely on Tuesday's council, I'll just prepare just a little overview of everything that we have been discussing with all the different department heads. In years past, Alderman Lennon, you said in the different budget meetings, you always heard, there is this big project, we need monies, where do we find it? There's a lot of those, and some of those, I know one of those you're gonna hear about at this council meeting from the fire department with their breathing apparatus that is like almost outdated And if we don't replace it, we're gonna have plenty of workers' comps coming in, so it's something that's necessary, but where do you find the dollars? So the mayor, I sat down with different department heads, I've been working with them to identify a lot of those larger capital expenses, including, if you drive by the police department, they're redoing the roof, you guys gave the okay on it. That's one of those expenses that if we didn't fix it, it'd be collapsing within the year, causing more damage and more expenses to us. So I'm putting together, I'm gonna try to present it. I have a packet for all the different aldermen at council. I'm just finalizing a few things. I've been working with a consultant that the county has provided us. And I'm working directly also with Ben and with Dana as they're gonna be helping out with all the quarterly reporting that we have to do. And I'll have a packet with just everything that summarizes those ARP dollars, what we have, how we can use it, and the process for how everything was done. And then I'll have in there, if you have any questions, you can always contact me. I'm always here at City Hall, just about 9 to 5. Monday through Friday, except during budget season where you're seeing me most evenings here. So I'll be giving something to council on Tuesday. That's my goal. I'm just finalizing a few things. I wanna make sure what I give you is accurate.
And one of those projects is our infrastructure upgrades that I mentioned, fiber optic builds. The key is we don't want to get into the situation of having to run our own and build our own fiber optic network. There's already too much construction going around the city. I don't even know when I would be able to do that. So we're trying to find a vendor that already has a significant presence in the city with fiber, and they'll be willing to sell us or lease us some of their private fiber. And there's really 3 big vendors. There's AT&T, there's Comcast, and there's Crown Castle that have the largest footprint in our city. I am gonna request through the council that we go to bid based on our scope and see who responds. Traditionally, the big carriers like AT&T do not want to sell customers direct private fiber because that's not their model. They want to sell you a monthly service agreement for AT&T, fiber TV or whatever it is. So, but we're still gonna go through it, we're gonna see who responds, and I have some idea of where those costs are. And at the same point, while we're increasing our capacity and our speeds, we'll also be extending and expanding the capability of all of our wireless products for community consumption. So while we have sporadic public wireless at our locations, this rebuild will factor in and engineer in a total build out of public Wi-Fi for every inch of city property that we service.
For our
Which means,
facilities, yeah.
like at the rec, for example, in the summer there's 1 million people that go through the pools and go through the events. Every one of those children and teenagers and adults will have access to free internet just for being there as a result of these upgrades. An endeavor that we can't even consider doing now because we don't have the capacity. But we can do it once we have this kind of expansion and this kind of ability to move our data in the directions that we want. So
And
there's some
yeah.
exciting ramifications for our citizens that I do want to mention here because it's not just internal changes. We'll be building out public-based free wireless high speed at all of our locations for free to use.
And we know it's a need, like Jim mentioned, over at our library, their parking lot has the free Wi-Fi. During COVID, you'd see people after hours parked outside in that parking lot utilizing it. Especially now that children, a lot of times, they work remotely. Not everyone has the dollars to expense continual good connectivity with Wi-Fi. It's an expense that a lot of people just don't have, and then this will at least give them access to it at a 24-hour basis.
Hey, Jim, will you be able to turn the microphones on for the zoning committee?
Sure, I'm just about done.
Yeah, no problem. They don't start until 7.
Say hi to the stream, because we're live.
So I think that's one thing that we've talked about in every budget meetings through the years is keeping up with those capital projects and not putting them to the side. Because if we're supposed to budget so much money in the future and we budget less, then we fall behind when it comes to some of our infrastructure and some of the things that we need to do to upgrade instead of coming in and saying we need this now.
Right.
So really kind of keeping track of what is it gonna cost us in the next 5 years to upgrade facilities or whatever it may be, and I think that's very important that we all do that in all the departments when we're looking at the budget. What's your wish list? What can you push back on? But what do we eventually have to do so we can move forward?
And not to nerd you out or anything, so we actually listened to you with that before. And our engineering was able to work with CMAP, and they actually found someone that they work with, an engineering department that has been doing workshops with staff here on how we can learn how to do our own capital plans. Currently, we have a capital plan that ends at the end of this year. They're usually 5-year plans. We're actually gonna be changing how we do things. Before, it was more engineering, just took a look at it every 5 years. Well, what's supposed to be done is it's supposed to be a 5-year rolling period. So what's gonna happen next budget season, what you're gonna see differently, is that finance and my department are gonna be spearheading at the very beginning, doing a rolling 5-year capital plan, so we are updated every year and we can get feedback continually from the department heads on evaluating what's already been on that capital plan, if we can check some things off, if things need to be changed into priority. And having that at the very beginning of every single budget season, something that is updated continually every year, will definitely help us. So at the end of this year, we're gonna be working on updating the capital plan, which needs to be done. But moving forward, it's gonna be updated every single budget season. So that way there's no surprises, like we've heard in the past. We won't have those roofs that are about to collapse.
Yeah.
Why is it about to collapse? So that way we are addressing and taking advantage of our resources, and actually it all rolls together. It'll actually make our budgeting season go smoother, less questions and less surprises. So we're actually doing that right now.
And what I like about it too is it provides source documentation as far as the basis for our budgeting that's organized and constantly reviewed, and it helps us prepare for our year-end audits too as well, as far as presenting, what the activity is and so forth.
So actually at one of the cows, I believe in November, they're gonna be doing a slight presentation on just what these workshops were entailing, what we've been doing, so everyone can know a summary. You don't have to listen to the, how many hours is this? 10 hours that we've sat through with these 3 workshops. First one was 4 hours, second one was just 3 hours, our last one's gonna be 3 hours coming up. Where we were like, oh no, we're gonna have to do this, we're coming out with something that's actually gonna change how we are doing things moving forward, so we can better ourselves fiscally and be more prepared. So you'll get to enjoy the brief summary, not the full 10 hours that we got to listen to.
I think that's
in
slated
November.
for the first cow in November.
Yeah.
That's all I have.
Just to add one more thing with, on the capital outlay, we've implemented, like, starting last year, measures where, we try to have our departments make a operating contribution toward our capital projects fund, so that this way, things that perhaps aren't funded via grants or, we can prepare for perhaps emergency capital outlays. And that's where on the budget for IT, we have that $50,000 contribution toward that project. Our bigger departments in the same fashion, fire, PD, as well as public works.
Yeah, we started that several years ago, so that's good.
So that's our little savings bank,
Yep.
Yes.
and we can prepare knowing that, for
Yeah.
instance, we're gonna need an engine and year this or whatever,
Correct.
Exactly.
That way we can have enough for that down payment at least.
Yeah.
One thing I did like, and we've done this in my firms that I've worked for, is really it's always hard to get the reduction of printers and copiers from staff because there's one here, there's one there. But it might be something to look at staff-wise to, change the culture, shall we say. And that might be something that could save you in the future, and that money, resources can go somewhere else within your department as well. But it's hard, it really is hard to take somebody's printer away if they have it right next to them. So,
Well, and that's what happens,
Yeah.
and the problem is there's no one sock that fits every foot,
Yeah.
right? So someone may have a totally valid reason, based on their job responsibilities, to be independent, but then the next person with a very similar job title right next to them doesn't need it. And then the middle manager just says, I'm not gonna upset the
Yeah.
status quo here, so I'll just give it to both of
Yeah.
them. And that's happened.
So it might just be a cultural thing that, you know, we have to look at and hold this.
Any words you guys can push down to people to compel them to unplug the printers would make me very happy.
All right. So the next thing is, and thank you, good job.
Sure.
Any new business that we need to talk about?
I'm gonna turn their mics on for the zoning.
Okay. No? So now I just need a motion to adjourn.
I made a motion to adjourn.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, we're good. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good.
Appreciate it.
You run it back tomorrow, same time, same place?
Same time,
Yes,
same
different.
place.
I feel lucky. Okay, I gotta have Melissa put together the minutes for the meeting.
right this one.
Okay, cool. I heard him say.
Sorry, everyone.
Yeah, it does.
Thanks a lot, guys.
All right, thank you.
You have a wonderful evening.
Oh, you too, thank you.
Thank you.
Good to see you, Jim. Thank you. Thank you very much. This made a lot more sense to me.
You're welcome. If you have any questions, please let me know.
All right, thank you.
I gotta stop our stream here.
Okay.